children. This is the 14.1 review and reinforcement video over reflection in a coordinate plane. So let's take a look at what that means. The reflection of a point in a coordinate plane is located on the opposite side of the axis, and it is the same distance from the axis. So think about your reflection in a mirror. It is the exact same, except it is the opposite. It is flipped. So let's look at two examples. Remember, this is our x-axis, and this is our y-axis. So let's take a look at point A. Point A is reflected across the y-axis to point B. And I know it's reflected across the y-axis because if I draw a line from point A to point B, it will travel across the y-axis. So I know this is reflected across the y-axis. It is also the same distance from the y-axis on both sides. So let's count. Point A to the y-axis. 1, 2, 3, 4. So it's 4 units away from the y-axis. Let's look at point B. 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 units away from the y-axis. Let's look at another example. Point D is reflected across the x-axis to point E. So we draw a line from the 2 points. What axis does it travel across? You got it, it travels across the x-axis. So point D is reflected across the x-axis to point E. Take a look at it. It's reflected across the x-axis, and it is the same distance from the x-axis from both points. Let's take a look at point D. How many units away from the x-axis is point D? 1, 2. Let's take a look at point E. 1, 2. So point D is reflected across the x-axis to point E. Let's take a look at another example. Reflect point A across the x-axis. So here's point A. We're going to do this one together. So we know we want to reflect across the x-axis. So here is our x-axis. So we know we want to travel across that x-axis. So first thing we need to do is let's get our coordinates of point A. So let's go ahead and type those in. So we start at our origin. So our x-coordinate is -3. Our y-coordinate is +1. So we have -3, +1. Okay, so that helps us. Now we're going to count the same distance from the x-axis on the opposite side. So let's take a look at point A. How many units away from the x-axis is point A? It's 1 unit away. So we go from 1 to 0. It's 1 unit away. So now I want to plot the point and draw a line. So I'm going to plot my point, and I'm going to draw my line to make sure that I am traveling across the x-axis. And I am. And I'm going to go ahead and label that point B. So now my coordinates of point B, so we start at our origin. We go over -3 and we go down to -1. So let's go ahead and fill that in. -3, -1. Let's take a look at those two coordinates. So we have -3, +1, and -3, -1. Notice our x-coordinate does not change when we are reflecting across the x-axis. Only our y-coordinate changed, and 1 and -1 are opposites. Okay, let's look at another example. I want to reflect point C across the y-axis. So here's my y-axis, so I know I want to draw a line that travels across that y-axis. So the first thing I want to do, let me get my coordinates of point C. So let's take a look. I start at my origin, and I always go side to side first. So my x-coordinate is +3. My y-coordinate is -4. So we have +3, -4. Okay, so that will help us in figuring out our coordinates down here for our new point. So I want to count the same distance from the y-axis on the opposite side. So I want to reflect across the y-axis, which means I want to travel across the y-axis. So let's count how many units away from the y-axis is point C. 1, 2, 3. I want to do the same thing on the other side of that axis. 1, 2, 3. And I'm going to go ahead and label that point D just because it makes it easier. So that's point D. And remember, you always want to draw your line to make sure that you are traveling across the y-axis that you want to reflect across. So let me go ahead and get my line. I'm going to start at my point C, that's my first part, my first point, and I want to draw my line. Am I traveling across the y-axis? Yes. And it's the same number of units away from the y-axis for point C and point D. Well, let's check. 1, 2, 3. Starting at the y-axis, 1, 2, 3. These are opposites or reflections. So what are my coordinates of point D? Well, I'm going to start at my origin, and I go side to side first. So I'm going to go to -3, -4. So let's go ahead and type that in. -3, -4. Let's go ahead and compare our coordinates for point C and point D. So point C is +3, -4. Point D is -3, -4. Notice when I'm reflecting across the y-axis, my y coordinates stay the same and my x coordinates are opposite. Okay, let's take a look at our next page. Now we want to find the distance between points. Okay, so let's take a look at point A and point B. What is the distance between point A and point B? Well, the first thing you want to look at is what are my number lines? What are my intervals in my number lines? And I'm counting by ones. So that makes it easy. So I know every jump is worth 1. So I'm going to start at point A and I'm going to count. There's 2 different ways we could do this. We can count the total number of jumps or steps from point A to point B, or I can count how many steps or jumps to the y-axis from A and how many steps from the y-axis to B. Let's start out with total jumps. Let's start at A. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So I know my distance from point A to point B is 6 units. Let's take a look at if I wanted to do them separately. So let's start out with just my distance from point A to the y-axis. 1, 2, 3, 4. So I know point A is 4 units. And point B from the y-axis, 1, 2, is 2 units. So we would do 4 plus 2 equals 6 units. So you could count either way. You could do total number of jumps, or you could do the jumps to the y-axis for both points and add them together. Let's take a look at our second example, the distance between point C and point D. Notice A and B were reflected across the y-axis. Point C and point D are reflected across the x-axis. So let's do our total number of jumps first. The total distance between point C and point D, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So 5 units is my total distance between point C and point D. Now if I broke that down, point C to the x-axis is only 1 unit. Point D from the x-axis, 1, 2, 3, 4, is 4 units. I would add those together. Either way, you get the same answer, whether you do the total number of jumps all together or you add the jumps to each axis from each point. Okay, one more example. Now this one's a tricky one, and I did this on purpose. Take a look at what our number lines are numbered by. So we have 0, and then we have nothing labeled here, and then 4, and then nothing labeled here, and then 8, nothing labeled here, and then 12, nothing labeled, and 16. So let's think about what are our intervals that we are numbering, that we are counting by. So 0, and it's not labeled here, but this would be 2, 4, 6, which isn't labeled, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16. So we're actually counting by twos. That's very important when you're figuring out your total distance. So let's take a look. The distance between point A and point B. Remember, every jump you're counting 2. So let's do our total jumps from A to B, and we're counting by twos, not ones. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, 22, 24, 26, 28 units is our total distance. If I wanted to break that down between point A and point B, and then I could add those together. Let's take a look at point A to the x-axis. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14. So point A is 14 units. Point B to the x-axis, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14 also. I want to add my 14 and my 14 together, which gives me 28 total units, which is the same as we got when we counted our total spaces. So same thing, let's look at point Y and point Z. What is my total distance? Remember, A and B were reflecting across the x-axis because we traveled across the x-axis. Point Y and point Z, I'm traveling across the y-axis. So let's take a look at my total points, my total units from point Y to point Z. Remember, we're counting by twos for every jump. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18. So it's 18 total units. But let's take a look at if we did Y separate and Z separate, and then we would add them together. How far away is Y from the y-axis? 2, 4. So only 4 units for point Y. Let's take a look at point Z. How far is that away from the y-axis? 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14. And then, of course, I take my 4 plus my 14, and that equals 18 units as well. You could do it either way. You could do total jumps and just count them, or you could do one point to an axis, the other point to the axis, and then add them together. Hopefully this has been helpful at finding the distance on a coordinate plane and learning about reflections of points. See you next time.